is useful to the society and which knowledge and history is to be disseminated. And these have a knock-on effect on society. Common sense do not come out of the blue. It comes from somewhere. We seek to explore in this conference the sources of these ideas that circulates in the society as common sense. I hope a discussion on decolonization can help us to reveal some of the ideas with the help of which imperialist powers manipulate the former colonies through pedagogy and knowledge creation. Through this activity, I hope we are able to open new pathways for collaboration between the academia and the people who lead as well as participate in the various anti-colonial struggles. The Birmingham Business School has initiated a 3-year project on decolonization. This conference is a very small part of it. The objective of this conference is to take the decolonial debate to the public and influence the debate and the discourse among the public in general. A second objective of this conference is to get some ideas from you and the public in general and take those ideas back to Birmingham Business School so that we can influence the curriculum and as well as the way we teach it. I hope you will find the procedures of this conference interesting and stimulating. Once again, thank you very much for coming to participate. Now I invite Paul Webster to chair this session and explain the proceedings.
Hi everybody. You can hear me? I'm just going to say my pointless task is to keep this day to timetable. So we're already behind. I'll try and catch up, and maybe we might have a short lunch break, which we can discuss and negotiate nearer the time. So with no further ado, I'm going to invite Saif, our friend, to introduce our keynote speaker.
Thanks, all. Thanks everyone for coming. It's a great pleasure to introduce our friend Sandy Fira here, the keynote speaker. People who have been looking into decolonial theory or who have been involved in decolonial activism must be very familiar with his work for some time. I came across his work more than a decade back when Sandy organized a workshop here in Birmingham with Islamic Human Rights Commission. So Birmingham has some pull over Sandy. And Sandy, as a short autobiographical thing, Sandy was born and brought up in Suriname, moved to Holland, studied there economics, and then became intellectual and activist there, writing on decolonial and anti-colonial and topics. He has written more than 25 books, numerous articles and essays, and have been part of various documentaries. His latest book, Decolonizing the Mind, is, in my view, very, very important contribution to decolonial theory. This book, if you didn't get a chance to read it, I would highly recommend it, because this book brings so many different strands of decolonial theory into one place. That is, that it gives you an encyclopedic, single encyclopedia of decolonial theories, various decolonial thinkers and so on. Not only that, it tries to build, or it tries to build philosophical foundations of decolonial theory, moving away from Eurocentric progressive thinking, or sort of Eurocentrism of progressive thinking in the present discourses. That's why when we were thinking about this particular conference, we thought of inviting Dew as our keynote speaker. So I'm sure we are all in for a treat with this particular conference and with his presentation. And the other thing that this book, Decolonizing the Mind, does is it not only goes into the philosophical foundations, but also looks into the application of these philosophical foundations into so-called hard sciences, such as mathematics. And a lot of times, when we talk about mathematics, technology, and so on and so forth, these topics, these fields are supposed to be much more neutral. For example, a very, very common question when we are talking about decolonizing mathematics or other sort of hard sciences is that if we are talking about decolonization now, 1 + 1 is not going to be 2, or is it going to be 3, or so on and so forth. It's a kind of a sarcastic remark that we get from various Eurocentric thinkers. So this book is an extremely important contribution made by our dear friend Sandu. So without further ado, I would like to invite you to make his keynote presentation. Duke, please.
Thank you, Saif. All right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for attending. I hope to have a fruitful discussion with all of you about an important topic of decolonizing the mind. I want to express my gratitude to the Birmingham Business School of the University of Birmingham for organizing this conference, and particularly my friends Paul, Thomas, and Saif for pulling this off. So let me start with the question, what is decolonizing the university about? Now, I have gone through, there are 160 universities in the UK or in England, I'm not sure which one is the, and I've looked into 32 of them, which had a web page on what decolonization means for them. And I've added 5 more organizations not related to the universities, like student bodies. And then I just read the web page saying, this is for us decolonization. And what I see is that a majority of them is about inclusive curriculum, about including also social struggle and injustice, race, gender, sexuality, class. It's about epistemology, yes, that's true, about power relations, empowering students, and let me see if I can put this description. Oh, anyway, so and what comes up with them is that now let me go here. The subject that they mention when it comes to decolonization is, as far as I'm concerned, related to the global north. Because decolonization in the global south is really different. I'll go into that somewhat later. So what happens here in the UK, that decolonization has become a language of social struggle now. And it replaces the language of social struggle, which used to be, from the 16th onwards, Marxism. Because Marxism was the language in which activists of those times tried to understand the world, including me. I grew up in the Marxist tradition. And what you see now is that things like racism, diversity, inclusion, power relations are not articulated in Marxism in a way that appeals to the generation of now. And so there you see that there's a rise of a theory, a philosophy that combines insights that different people outside the framework of Marxism, intersectionality, white privilege, if it comes to racism, they try to get a grips of it. Now, that's in the global north. But in the global south, the narrative is different. You see that where liberation movements that were rooted in the Marxist philosophy and are looking for other narratives of liberation go back to civilizations which have been overpowered and oppressed by Western civilizations, but were not destroyed. They are still there, and they bring ideas about how to look at society. Islam, Hinduism, Confucianism, indigenous liberation philosophy, Ubuntu in Africa. And these are critiques of Eurocentrism from a totally different perspective than we see in the global north. The issues of social struggle in the global south are also different. In the global south, you don't talk about diversity. You know, it's not an issue there. But in a country where you have 10–15% people of colors, then diversity is an issue. It's not an issue in Zambia. What you do see is that one of the issues that decolonization touched upon and this new generation of activists is looking up is epistemology. And the way they articulate it is that the knowledge of the West has been colonized. And how has it been colonized? And what you then get as an analysis is that the reading list, why is my curriculum white? We need to have other authors on our reading list in our curriculum than the white males from 5 countries. We need to give voice to people of color who until recently didn't have a voice. We need to have diversity and inclusion within our curriculum. We need to empower students, especially students of colors, and address power imbalances in the university. These are the issues that are being brought up. If you look at all these web pages, this is what decolonization is about. Now, I'll present a total different view of decolonization, but I want to stress that I present it not as a better view, but as another view. It's up to people to decide what for their struggle and what fits their narrative is best for them. So, in my view of decolonization, I use the concept of pluriversity to argue that different views of a problem are not necessarily antagonistic views. They can be complementary views. And pluriversity requires a dialogue between proponents of the different views in order to move forward to find solutions. So we don't have to fight each other. We can talk to each other and see what kind of problems are we trying to solve with what kind of theory. So, what is decolonizing the mind, DTM? I argue that DTM is based on 3 pillars. One, it is a critique of Eurocentric knowledge production. Second, let me go to the critique first. The critique is both a general critique and a fundamental critique on the level of the individual disciplines. So a lot of the critique which you will find on the webpage on those talking about decolonization is a general critique that the knowledge which the West has produced is only one part of knowledge. But in DTM I argue that the knowledge that has been produced by the West should be criticized in itself. It's not that, oh, it is a good knowledge and other good knowledge. No, we criticize the knowledge for being invalid. Eurocentric knowledge is criticized not for being dominant, but for being invalid. And that's what I'm trying to do throughout the book, by looking into the discipline, why it is invalid knowledge. Now, in order to understand Eurocentric knowledge production, you have to understand the history of knowledge production in Europe. In the history of mankind, it's a very young history. Mankind has produced knowledge for thousands of years. If you want to assess what is the quality of knowledge in a civilization, go to architecture. And then you'll see many civilizations. How did the Egyptians build these pyramids? What kind of great architectural things are all across the world which are amazing. Now, in Western knowledge production, they said that this knowledge, these buildings, all the architecture, is not scientific knowledge. Because scientific knowledge is modern knowledge. This is knowledge, yes. Probably they didn't even know how they did it, but they did it. But we argue that no, we have to look into the theoretical construct that made this technological and align with it the social formations, the society that made this. How were they organized? It was not intuitive. People have thought about it. So what we do, when we criticize European knowledge production, we criticize this also from the second point, from the alternatives that were already there. How do you organize an economy? Buddhism, Islam had produced ideas about this. How do you set up a financial system? Islamic banking had developed a whole theoretical framework for it. How do you set up the relations between humans and nature? Go to Bolivia and you'll see highly developed theories about the relation between humans and nature. So when we look at how knowledge was colonized, we don't do only the critique, we look at it from the alternatives. And then the third thing is, we live in an age now where we need to move beyond the old world colonization, the world civilization, the colonized civilization, to a new civilization. So if decolonizing, we're talking about the decolonization, we talk about a new world civilization, which is not on the agenda of the universities. But it should be, because the universities create the knowledge base for a civilization. A civilization is a collection of societies based on a particular knowledge base. An Islamic civilization is based on Islamic knowledge, how to set up your society. A Chinese Confucian civilization is based on this idea of how Confucius articulated how to set up a society. So, if you have decolonization and you think it's about race and gender, etc., but not about civilization, that's a different ballgame. You see? And we need to go on that level. So, when we create new knowledge, we use our creativity, we use ideas from other knowledge systems, we use the critique, and then go on reconstructing knowledge. That is what decolonization is about. Reconstructing knowledge is not a general thing. Reconstructing knowledge is reconstructing the disciplines. What is decolonial economic theory? What is decolonial social theory? What is decolonial mathematics or biology? You know, this is how do you create the new disciplines. Now, my critique of decolonial theory, I have a critique of it, is that because it is so young, what, 40 years or so, a few decades, while the European Enlightenment is 350 years old. From 1650 onwards, the colonialism started with Christian theology from 1500 to 1650. Then with the rise of the European Enlightenment, you get the modern knowledge production where the discipline arose, and decolonial liberalism has a history of 350 years. Marxism, a major component of the European Enlightenment, has a history of 250 years. Decolonial theory is very young, only a few decades. So it is an amalgamation of scattered contributions, important contributions. I don't say it's not important, it's important. But what we need to do is learn from liberalism and Marxism. And what do we learn from liberalism and Marxism? Is that they are comprehensive, coherent, and integral framework. Comprehensive means that you have a liberal theory of how to set up your economy, how to set up your political system, how to set up your society, how to set up your cultural system. You have some Marxist theory about it. So the European Enlightenment has produced two major schools of a comprehensive theory that takes into account the major sectors of society, which comes into the disciplines of social theory, economic theory, political theory, cultural theory. It is coherent because the concepts produced in the different disciplines don't contradict each other. So if you have a concept, an economic concept in Marxism of the labor theory of value, it's very coherent with the social theory of class. The labor theory of value tells you that surplus value that is generated by the worker is being appropriated by the capitalist to the market system, aligns with the concept of the proletariat as the working class and the capitalist as the ruling class. Coherent means it's not contradictory. Now, you could have a decolonial theory that is in favor of a planned economy, but also decolonial theorists that are in favor of entrepreneurship. Where is the coherence? Where is the, And then, the other thing we can learn from the European Enlightenment is that it is integral, meaning that they have one basic concept where the whole theory is constructed. And liberalism is individualism. With individualism comes this concept of the market economy that organizes the structures, the parliamentary system as a political expression of individual will, etc. In Marxism is the concept of class. That is where the whole theoretical framework is based on. What is it in decolonial theory? I argue that is mental slavery. The colonization of the mind, that is it. So, my argument is we need to go there, and constructing an integral, coherent, comprehensive theory cannot be the work of one person. It should be the work of many people involved. Right. Now, taking mental slavery, which, by the way, I didn't invent, comes from Marcus Garvey and comes from a whole history of struggle, and Garvey put it in this concept of emancipate yourself from mental slavery, and none but ourselves can free our mind. And Bob Marley put it up in this redemption song. So if I take mental slavery and then look at what does mental slavery mean for the basic of knowledge production, then I could outline the difference between Eurocentric epistemology and DTM. One is, first, the definition of epistemology. The second is the sources of knowledge. The third is the object of knowledge. And the last, the role of ethics. Now, if you go into the definition of epistemology, in Eurocentrism, the theory of knowledge, epistemology is the theory of knowledge. What is knowledge? How is it produced? It's about searching the truth. That is epistemology. Finding out how do we understand the natural and social world. In DTM, the notion of lies is inherent in the Eurocentric epistemology. The notion of lies is absent in Eurocentric epistemology. So, in the DTM methodology, we have created a method to detect the lies. And it consists of the notion that knowledge, the collection of insights and understanding about the natural and social world, knowledge is expressed in concepts. And concept describes and explains certain aspects of the world. So concept is the basic unit of knowledge. And it consists of 5 elements that help you to understand how lies are constructed in Eurocentrism. The first is terminology. Columbus is a discoverer. That's the terminology for a criminal. Because Columbus, the first act of Columbus was the kidnapping of 7 Tainos, which is a crime. So you use the terminology to construct lies. You won't find this in Eurocentric epistemology. Go from Plato to NATO, from Plato to philosophers of now, they don't accept that lies are part of epistemology. And then the observation, second element. The observation, what kind of observation are you putting in your narrative? The narrative of Columbus is the discovery. That's why the terminology is discoverer. So you leave out the fact of the kidnapping of the Tainos and the genocide that follows from it. So observation, the collection of lies, is one of these elements. Then the analysis. So the observation are the descriptive part, and the analysis offers the framing and the storyline with a certain logic, and that helps us explain and understand the narrative of the natural and social reality we live in. So in the case of Columbus, the narrative was Columbus tried to find a route to India, and by mistake he ended up in the West, and when he came there he thought he was in India, and that's why he called those peoples Indians. Imagine a Chinese trying to find a way from China to Americas, end up in Europe, an Indian end up in Europe, trying to find a route to China, doesn't know that China is around, and calls all the Europeans Chinese. And for centuries the Europeans are called Chinese, and accepted as that. So the analysis is a way of constructing a lie. And the theory. The theory of the discovery, the concept of discovery is part of the theory of modernity, the rise of modernity, and the rise of the world to a new high level of civilization. We have another view. The view of the indigenous people of the Americas is that it's a decline of human civilization, where there were 95% of them were killed. And the last element is ethics. Knowledge in the West is about true or false. Knowledge in other civilizations was about true and false and right and wrong. And leave right and wrong, then knowledge becomes objective. And that is how it was constructed. And if you leave ethics, you create a lie. Now, This is a difference, clear difference between DTM philosophy and Eurocentric philosophy. The other difference is this. The evolution of Eurocentric philosophy was in opposition against Christian theology. Christian theology, for the first 150 years of colonialism, was the ruling narrative of knowledge. So if you want to know about the world, you go to the Bible. And the theologians will tell you how to understand the world. But because the Christian caliphate, a caliphate is a religious political entity, the Christian caliphate basically oppressed scientists. So the scientists had to be in opposition. And then in that opposition, they leave sources of knowledge which they can't deal with. Innate knowledge, common sense, social interaction, creativity, imagination, cosmology, all these sources of knowledge are left out and reduced to observation and reasoning because of the natural sciences. The natural sciences could observe and reason. And so other forms of knowledge were left out of the epistemology. If you do that, I'll show it with mathematics, you can get very strange results. Now, then the object of knowledge. Because in Eurocentric epistemology, the object of knowledge is how to understand the natural and social world. The spiritual world is not part of knowledge because you can't measure it. So you say, hey, that is not knowledge, it's fantasy, you could do whatever. So there's no way to say anything beyond observation and reasoning. But the spiritual world, in many civilizations, is the source of ethics. And if ethics is part of knowledge, you see, then in those civilizations, thinking about the spiritual world is part of knowledge. It's not the case where in Eurocentric knowledge it just becomes secular. And then the role of ethics. Ethics has been removed from knowledge in Eurocentrism, but not successfully. It's shoved under the rug because it's there all the time. But they put it under the cloak of objectivities, and if you peel it out, you see racism, you see all kinds of other ethics involved in knowledge production. So, I'll give you an example of DTM epistemology applied to mathematics. And I say this because people laugh when you say, how can you decolonize 1 and 1 is 2? In fact, there were two guys, Russell and Whitehead, who wrote a book to prove that 1 and 1 is 2, 360 pages. So, why did they do it? Why, if it's so obvious that they do it? Because mathematics in the Western civilization moved from observation, from empirical validation, meaning that 1, in many civilizations, 1 is the representation of quantity. 2 is the representation of quantity. But in Eurocentric mathematicism, you get something called axiomatic thinking. Axiomatic, an axiom is a proposition without proof. So what they say now, Russell and all these people are saying, 1, we don't think of it as related to empirical truth. So 1 is not a representation of, 1 is a definition. We define 1. We define 1 as an element of a collection. But if you do that, how do you prove 1 and 1 is 2? When you have mathematics based on empirical, you say, I prove it because we call this 1, But if I have another one, we call it 2, and I could do addition, subtraction with these numbers, because I can see them. It's empirical. But if you don't see it, it's elements, then you get strange things. Now, I'll give you what a strange things is, but I'll tell you that I could put out 6 elements of critique of mathematics, decolonial critique. I'll give you only one of them. That is the critique of axioms, and I have some here what they explain what an axiom is, which is a concept without proof. Let me go here. Here's where you can say when mathematics goes wrong. This is a YouTube video on the Ramanujan series. Srinivasa Ramanujan was an Indian mathematician, and he calculated what the outcome is of 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 3 till infinity. And if you look at the video, very ingenious, the outcome is 1 minus 12, minus 1 divided by 12. And when the guy explained this, he's ecstatic. So how can this be 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus? But the math shows you that it is minus 1 divided by 12. Because observation and reasoning, and in the case of mathematics, not observation, only reasoning is the source of knowledge, you leave common sense out. But common sense can tell you, if I give you $1 and $2 and $3, you never end up in debt, you become immensely rich. That is what common sense tells you. Leave common sense out, you get nonsense. You see? So, I put this forward to show that it is possible to decolonize mathematics. I take only one aspect of it. And decolonizing mathematics is important because it goes into the social sciences. If you write as a sociologist or an economist, let's take an economist writing an article, a scientific article, and there's no graph and no formula, and it is a low quality. You are trained, to put some statistics in it. There was a school in Austria, Karl Menger is his name, the guy, who criticized this idea that you understand economic process through formulas. He says, no, an economic process are real interaction between human beings, and that is what you need to understand. The formulas are just methods to help you understand, to help you describe it, not even to understand it. The math helps you to describe it. The understanding doesn't come from math. The understanding comes from knowing how these processes are interacting. Now, let me see where I am now. Right here. Okay, I use this axiom concept from mathematics and argue that axioms are not only in mathematics. You get them all over the social sciences. Take political science. Parliamentary democracy is the best political system. Why? Because. Why? Because. You don't have to prove it. You just accept it. Because if you go to the empirical proof, then suddenly there are people saying, I have empirical proof that parliamentary democracy is not universal. First, and second, that depending per country, there are different forms of democracy, different forms of getting people involved in governing their lives. And for some countries, other systems might be better than other countries. Zhang Weiwei, a Chinese political scientist, builds the argument of it. I deal with him in the book. And he says there are procedural democracy and people's democracy. And we have a matter of validation. How does the system perform in elevating the life of its citizens in all its aspects? Economic, political, social, cultural. And how do you explain this performance? And he then introduces empirical validation as a criterion to judge it. I have 50 minutes, okay? Now, you could see it in many other disciplines. You will find this idea that there are axioms in social sciences, in cultural studies, etc. So, decolonization is about a critique of these propositions which are presented as axioms. So, what is now the task of decolonization? What should be, in my view, on the agenda of the universities? That is the reconstruction of science. And I put it in 6 steps. The questioning of the purpose of the discipline, the looking at the basic concepts, look at new concepts that you can think of to reconstruct the discipline, outline the methodology, set up the research and teaching trajectory, and develop the textbooks for the universities. And I think when we have discussion and breakout groups, you might want to look at it, at this methodology, for disciplines which you are trained in. But I'll take one, philosophy. And then I'll discuss how to reconstruct philosophy from a decolonial point of view. And I don't talk about philosophy in general. I talk about teaching a subject the history of Western philosophy. You see, if I take the subject of history of Western philosophy, I don't talk about, oh no, we need to get other philosophies also on board. We need to look into Islamic philosophy. No. Yes, we need to do that, but that's not the topic I would teach. I would teach the topic history of Western philosophy. So what I do, I start with collecting the textbooks, obviously, that teaches the history of Western philosophy, and do a DTM analysis of it. And one of the first things you will do, if you do that, is you will look at how colonialism impacted philosophy. And I outline a theory of racism in the book that explains how knowledge production and racism were intertwined. We have racism as a concept of superiority and inferiority of human beings. This concept was in 3 phases. Before the Enlightenment, we have theological racism, where the authority of knowledge were Christian theologians. And they argued how the people they colonized in Latin Abya-Yala is the term that indigenous people use for the Americas, why these people were inferior, because they were not Christianized. And Christian theology was the basis for understanding superiority and inferiority. Then comes the European Enlightenment in its first phase with biology, philosophy, natural sciences, and the rise of the transatlantic enslavement. I have a graph in the book that explains how the Enlightenment coincides with the rise of the transatlantic enslavement. And then philosophers and natural sciences argued superiority, inferiority along the lines of race and biology. With the abolition of slavery and the colonization of the rest of the world and the rise of the social science, biology was then replaced by culture. You have not inferior human beings, you have inferior cultures. Western culture is superior. How does this play out in the textbooks of philosophy? That is what we should look into. Now, I'll go into that in a minute. Western philosophy, if we look at Western philosophy, the critique we could have from a decolonial perspective is that the purpose of philosophy to gain understanding of our thinking about humans and nature, that purpose leaves out, doesn't acknowledge the colonization of the mind. That's a critique we have on Western philosophy. It doesn't look at the influence of colonialism on philosophy. We have other critiques, which I already mentioned. Secularism as the basis of Western philosophy of knowledge, the sources of knowledge being limited to observation and reasoning, the system of logic is true and false. In Jainism, they have 7 values of knowledge. Something could be true, something could be false, some could be true and false, some could be uncertain. There are 7 values of it. And positivism then becomes the rule. So Western philosophy doesn't acknowledge the creation of lies as the mechanism of colonization of the mind. I already explained it. So in a DTM study of Western philosophy, we look at how did the colonization of the mind, how was it embedded in Western philosophy. One of the things, for example, is that Western philosophy regards Greece as the foundation of it. Every textbook begins with Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, etc. They never acknowledge that these Greek philosophers were indebted to Africa for their knowledge. There's ample evidence of it in the work of the Greeks. Read Socrates. Socrates didn't write, but Plato talked about Socrates, but read Plato, read Aristotle, read Thales, read all these major, Pythagoras, the biography of Pythagoras. Pythagoras spent 27 years in Egypt. So the acknowledgement that the Greek knowledge was indebted to Africa is left out of Western philosophy. And not only that, they think that the Greeks were whites. But the Greek themselves, I'll give you the example of Socrates. Where's Socrates? I don't have an image of Socrates here, do I? I thought I had. Yeah. Socrates is here. If you look at Socrates closely, he has African features. My friend Kwame Nimako looks exactly like Socrates. You see, he's African. So the idea that the Greek philosophy was a white philosophy is itself a racist notion embedded in Western philosophy. Okay. So you see how we reconstruct the science. We look at the purpose, we take some basic concept, searching for the truth, lies is not part of it, and then we look up other concepts, what we can think of. And then we set up a research trajectory with students to go into this. And I'll give you an example, a concrete example of Descartes. Because Descartes, every philosophy books of Western philosophy regard Descartes as the founder of Western philosophy. Why? Because Descartes basically was saying knowledge needs not to be derived from the Bible, but from reasoning. I could argue and reason. And one of the things he tried to argue in his reasoning is, how do I know that I exist? Well, if you use common sense as a source of knowledge, this is a ridiculous question. That would be the answer. Because what does it mean to say, I don't exist? I don't exist is a nonsense thing. You can't say, I don't exist. It's just, in a language, contradictory. But anyway, so he starts with this idea. When I talk about philosophers, I always go to the source I don't go to somebody writing about Descartes. I read Descartes. I read Kant. I read Hegel. You know, and Descartes built the reasoning up with the notion of hyperbolic doubt. So he said, I'm doubting everything. I can doubt whether I exist, whether I sleep, what happens. The only thing I cannot doubt is that I'm thinking. And so he says, I think, therefore I am. He was not the first one, by the way, to say it. There were others, thinkers came with this conclusion in another way. But because his source of knowledge was only reasoning, not even observation, he could come to this conclusion which common sense already told you. You don't need to think to know that you exist. Even if you're on the toilet, you can know that you exist. You put your hand into the fire and you know that you exist. You see? In Ubuntu philosophy, African Ubuntu philosophy, they have even a saying, I am because we are, saying that suppose you are the only person on the world, how do you know if you dream or not? You can't. You just can't know. Only if somebody wakes you up, you can know if you dream, if you dreamt or not. So, social knowledge is a source of knowledge. Imagination is another source of knowledge. And I give this example of Shuangzi, Chinese philosopher, 2,000 years before Descartes. He came up with this thing which blows your mind away. He said once Shuangzi dreamed he was a butterfly flitting and fluttering around, happy with himself and doing as he pleased. He didn't know he was Shuangzi. Suddenly he woke up and there he was, solid and unmistakably Shuangzi. But he didn't know if he was Shuangzi who dreamed he was a butterfly or a butterfly dreaming he was Shuangzi. This is a level of imagination that goes beyond Descartes, you see? And I bring this forward to show if we reconstruct a discipline and we go towards other civilization, you get a lot of new knowledge and new way of looking at things. And this goes for every discipline, economic, social, even physics. Because physics, you would argue, no, but physics is all observation, reasoning, you know, and you use the math. Galileo said, you know, God wrote the universe in the language of mathematics. So you could test it all. Only on the last frontier of physics. Where do you come from? What does physics answer? The Big Bang. That is where we come from. The Big Bang is basically the origin of universe. And there it goes wrong. How do you know? How do you know that there was a Big Bang? And then they say we observe it, you know, we see the extension of the universe. So at one point in time there must be contraction. Why? Because in first of expansion there is contraction. But then this is based on mathematics. This is not on observation, because they haven't observed contraction, they only observe expansion. But the mathematics, and they use string theory for that, the mathematics tells you there must be a point of contraction. And then Stephen Hawkins, in his book where he explains this, says, oh, but what happens at the moment of Big Bang itself? He says that the law of nature stopped working. How do you know that? Where is observation and reasoning? Where is it? This is a belief that any other person can have any other belief on. So, we could go into biology, yeah? and say, oh, where is Charles Darwin's theory based on? The survival of the fittest. It's based on liberalism, on individualism. But we have a lot of examples in the animal kingdom of social behavior, not individual behavior, of animals. So, what I want to say is, we are able to reconstruct the sciences. Decolonization is not about diversity. It's not about giving my white, why is my white curriculum white? It's not about hearing voices that we're not here or having another reading list. Yes, if you are fine with that, fine with me. Do it. Outside the UK, outside the global north, this is what decolonization is about. It goes into the depth of it, and we move from general observation about epistemology to the discipline itself. How do we decolonize philosophy, social economic theory, biology, etc., economic theory? I think this is a job that can be done, but it requires the involvement of many more thinkers and many more maybe around here. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Within the time limit.
Perfect timing. Next, first of all, someone wanted to take some photographs of the event. Does anyone object to having photographs taken? People are happy? It's okay then. Fine, so I want to introduce now Tom Sebastian, lecturer at the University of Birmingham, and he's going to try to give, in a very short time span, he's going to try to show how you can begin to decolonise the teaching of economics. So it's kind of an example of what we're trying to achieve. This afternoon we'll have a chance in small groups to explore our own interests. Here's an example of Tom's interest in decolonising his own subject. Tom, over to you.
Tom, could you stand a bit closer?
So thank you very much, Paul. Western universities is a key center where knowledge is produced, consecrated, institutionalized and naturalized. It is during the colonial times, it is in the universities that the colonial rulers learned about the colonized people, and they were told, they learned how to oppress them and how to exploit them. So universities provided were a place of production of oppressive knowledge. They bolstered discourses that that popularized discourses that supported colonial endeavors and provided ethical as well as intellectual ground for continuing to exploit. As the European form of knowledge spread, the indigenous knowledge were suppressed. There were also some universities started in the colonies. These universities in the colonies acted as outposts or extensions of the universities in the colonial countries. The formal colonialism ended in the 1950s and 60s, but the logic of the colonies has continued to exist. So an intellectual imperialism is continuing. Now movements like Black Lives Matter and Rhodes Must Fall has led to a re-examination of these content of these universities. And within economics itself, there has been already a critique of the mainstream economics that they are unable to explain how inequalities are reproduced generation after generation, and why structural inequalities exist in society. In my opinion, it is a good idea for us to understand this as citizens and as activists and as economics, because our struggle to establish a just society also should be combined with our struggle against those ideas that obscures inequality that exists in society. Within the economics profession, this demand for decolonization of economics is very much related to the diversification of economics. So here diversification economics, we say, okay, there is no module on slavery. There is no module on this. So let us add that and fill that gap. That's a fill gaps approach. So decolonization goes much beyond that. I am completely new to this topic, and I had to do some research, and I found there is a good bit of literature, and whatever I am saying here can be found in this. These are the main references, and also economics, some economics in UK have come together and have formed this decolonization and diversification economic network, and they are also putting out a lot of literature out there trying to influence the academics. Now, let me start with what is Eurocentrism as understood by economics, and what is decolonizing mind, economic mind would be. Now, Eurocentrism has been criticized from different point of view. We can identify broadly these critics into two groups. One is the post-colonial theorists like Edward Said, who wrote the book Orientalism. And according to that view, Eurocentrism is a set of attitudes that do not recognize the inequalities that is existing in society, and the specific types of regime, that oppressive regime that helps accumulation, expropriation, and exploitation. This, I would say, is a soft critic of Eurocentrism. A much harder version of Eurocentrism comes from Samir Amin. It is coming from an anti-imperialist Marxian stand. According to them, this is a global project to continue the colonial project. It reinforces imperialism and systematic inequalities. The dominant understanding, that is the mainstream understanding of capitalism, economic understanding of capitalism, fails to take into account the post-colonial capitalist development. From this, this decolonial network has defined what is Eurocentrism from the economics point of view. It is an idea that capitalism originated on its own, autonomously, endogenously within European countries, and that itself is a result of Enlightenment values of rationality and objectivity. Anything outside this framework is considered as inferior and devalued. So, within this view, capitalism is a global hegemonic order with Europe at its center, and the rest of the world is expected to follow the path of Europe, guided by European ideas, and it ignores slavery and oppression that underpinned the development of capitalism. And all type of, this is still continuing. This colonialism is continuing in a new form, and that idea is not discussed at all, ignored, completely ignored. So what would it mean if economics have a decolonized mind? It would have some important points. It would recognize the fact the modern world is built on exploitation and enslavement of Africa, Asia, and American peoples. And capitalism, we know capitalism coincided with slavery, but not only it coincided with slavery, without slavery capitalism would not have been possible in Europe. This is the second point. Third is colonial states developed some scientific ideas, supposedly scientific ideas like racism to support the superiority and justify capitalism. A fourth point about having a decolonized mind is to say that knowledge creation is influenced by the power relations that is existing globally. And finally, a globalized mindset will try to reframe the ideas about capitalism, taking into consideration the experiences of the people of the colonies. Those are now they are invisible, and reject the silencing of European views. Now that we have an idea about what it means to have a decolonized mind, decolonized economic mind, we can look at economics as a discipline. we can say economics is Eurocentric. Economics is presented in economics, mainstream economics. Economics is presented as, capitalism is presented as a rational and organized system with a number of laws that is universally applicable. These laws are neutral and universally applicable. And they say these laws are imperfect, but they can be managed. In this view, contradictions and antagonisms that is part of capitalism is ignored. In recent years, this Eurocentrism has increased as the area of economic area that economics discuss has narrowed. Now, in my discussion here, we are going to discuss the methodological and theoretical issues of economics. In recent years, the economics area covered by economics in the mainstream economics has become theoretical. So there is another area called heterodox economics, which is not being, unfortunately, not taught in mainstream universities. The mainstream economics depends upon neoclassical understanding, and it looks at individuals as rational and consistent economic actors, perfectly functioning market, and equilibrium as the starting point. And during the last few decades, there have been some changes. Now they don't assume markets are perfect, imperfect market. We work with imperfect market, and also we don't assume that individuals are rational. Instead, they have formed that bounded rationality. So these economic ideas are embedded in this is the methodological individualism. What we mean by this is the economic agent makes individuals are the decision makers. So the firms and households are taken as independent units. So in this, people who trained in this way, in these ideas, a graduate who goes through a mainstream economics, for them it is very difficult to understand why structural inequalities exist, exploitation and etc., domination and the whole social process. For them it is very difficult. Their mind would be set up in this way. And in recent years, economics, also there has been some changes in the epistemological changes. So economics now look at as themselves as modelers. So any economic problem or non-economic problem, we can express them in a model. And the idea is that if you have a model, if you make a model, you take some important variables and ignore many others. And then they say that if you do that, we can be more rigor and more objective. And that is how some economics think. Esther Duflo, in her, she got this Nobel Prize in 2017. This said in this speech, in a speech, she said, economics are like plumbers. What they are doing is a technical job. Now, broadly speaking, we can decolonize economics in two ways. One is to expose the Eurocentrism, that it is this Eurocentric ideas that is perpetuating inequalities in society, globally and in society. So that is one way we can decolonize economics. The second is explore non-Eurocentric ideas, like how imperialism, dispossession, racism, etc. There are some theories like dependency theory, for example, or theory of neocolonialism, which are now discussed in the mainstream universities and mainstream, but they are peripheral. Bring it to the center. So this is two ways in which we can try to decolonize the economics. Now, when we say decolonizing and taking into account the experiences of knowledge from other peoples, we are not suggesting decolonizing economics, are not suggesting let us replace Eurocentric economics with, let us say, Islamic economics or Hindu economics or Buddhist economics. We are not saying this, but what we are saying is Eurocentric economics gives some, they are speaking from a privileged position. These ideas gives them a comparative advantage. So the ideas developed gives them some particular group or some particular countries some advantages. So that is what we are saying. We make this clear. And also within the European economics itself, Eurocentric economics itself, the class framework is a better way of understanding. So why do the inequalities exist? Why do we can say that markets are not functioning? Let's start one more institutions, some more institutions, then markets can change situation. But that is not sufficient. But Marxian analysis can explain, even when the markets are perfect, capitalism is very competitive, why inequalities persist. Now looking at economics curricula itself, we can see it is Eurocentric by focusing on economics teaching. Economics teaching heavily focuses on textbooks, and these textbooks rarely discuss the power dominance that is existing in the society. They are present, especially the first year undergraduate study, they are presented as some principles to be learned. What are these principles? Markets is a good way of organizing things, and sometimes markets don't work, but we can make the markets work efficiently with the government intervention. So all these textbooks, you will find most of the textbooks have something called thinking like an economics, how to think like an economics, which itself is a subset of these principles. Now, undergraduate economics is provided with some tools to make decisions, good decisions. So economic graduates are well employed, our graduates all very good jobs, because they have these tools, they are very good, useful to the society. But they may not be very good social scientists, but they have some tools to analyze and make decisions in a business situation. So these economic textbooks do not expose the students to different various schools of thought, competitive schools of thought, like neoclassical, all of it is neoclassical, Marxian or Keynesian understanding of economic phenomenon. Now we can decolonize economic teaching in 3 different ways. That is what the decolonization network is suggesting. That embed our understanding of economy within broader social process. Now one of the blames against economics profession is that they see economics as separated from society. Something they take out. In fact, there are some economics, especially after the empirical turn of economics, this behavioral economics has come. I have heard academics say, now economics, we have learned all the laws. It is not it. But we have to now take these individuals to a room and try to understand his mind. So there is something called behavioral laboratories in most of the leading economics departments. So they take these people and analyze their mind. Whose mind are they analyzing? We have better knowledge of American undergraduate students now. That is universally applicable. So Birmingham University also has got a lab. My department has a lab, Birmingham Behavioral Economics Laboratory, where they catch some undergraduate students and give them some money and ask them to make decisions, allocate this money, and then the analysis of that allocation of the money and how their mind has worked. Now what we are saying is that can be reversed. We can put this economics back as a social science, as a social process. An example, for example, of this model making and methodological individualism is the marriage. Some economics have interpreted marriage as a market decision. So individuals have some characteristics like education, income, look, personality, and they also have some market power. So you match this. So in the marriage market, they try to match this, and that explains why people with a similar taste, similar qualities marry. That explains the marriage. And also the market power. The men have more market power, so that is why they marry younger women. Men are older. So this explains. But we can see that this only partially explains it. It's not a full explanation. Marriage is a social process. So separating them. But that writer actually got a Nobel Prize in economics in 1987. So what we are saying is, take economics as a social science and as a social process. A second is to challenge the field's claim to neutrality and universality. So here what I mean is to say that economics claim these laws are neutral and universal. We can expose them, how these ideas are arisen when we teach them, how these ideas are arisen, did not come out of nowhere. Third is where we can expose decolonize economics teaching is to how this knowledge production is embedded in unequal power relations. Now for example, to take an example, in the 1950s and 60s, most of us know, it was common sense. Keynesian economics was common sense. It was all right. Use fiscal policy. But from 90s we know that that has been replaced by rational expectations theory. So now, this is not the result of the purity or the strength of the internal logic, but it is a result of a power struggle that took place. So that is how, but we don't teach them. We just teach them smoothly moved from Keynesianism to rational expectations theory, and this is more rational, more applicable, etc. So that is what we said, we can expose this. So decolonization is to, when we teach economics, we need to expose our students to these struggles, that struggles and the power inequalities that exist in our society. Another way we can decolonize is a better understanding of history of economic thought. So it moved from one thought to the other dominant, whether it is in monetary theory or in development theory. This all result that there was some power struggle, and one group or one thought had actually won this. So we just discussed them in our history of economic thought module, moved from one to the other, not relating the power struggle that took place behind it. Now at present, the methodology of teaching instrumental. Now an instrumental methodology is to equip students with some knowledge, some theory, and help the students to apply this theory to the knowledge. Paulo Freire criticized this method, that instrumental method looks at the students like an empty vessel, and we put some knowledge into their head. And Paulo Freire said, replace it with critical pedagogy. It should be student-centered. An undergraduate student is an adult, so we can take into account that student's own experience as a starting point. And by critiquing the everyday concepts, it is possible to create a critical thinking within the students. This is more appropriate methodology for decolonized teaching. Let me conclude my presentation now. Now we know economic and political neocolonialism is well known. We know that this is done through international economic and political institutions. And now there is also intellectual imperialism, and this is done through control of institutions of knowledge, and there universities play a very important role, and also transmission of this knowledge. Knowledge created in Western countries are Eurocentric, and universities created during colonialism justified racism. And we saw how we can decolonize economic teaching. Decolonizing economics is not just about teaching. There is a strong relationship between Eurocentric science and imperial expansion. Advancement of powerful specific kinds of knowledge is a powerful tool to expert influence over the rest of the world. For example, the type of knowledge that is now economic knowledge that is existing creates a consensus, a support for Washington consensus, and post-Washington consensus failed, so we have post-Washington consensus. So what we can do by discussion of decolonized economics is that it will not immediately bring about guaranteed justice or equality, but at least this debate can delegitimize and undermine, challenge the romanticized view of capitalism and allow a fresh perspectives on structural inequalities. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Thomas. Let me now introduce our next speaker, Mohammed Idras, who's going to say a bit about himself and then talk about his new book, which is linked to our discussions today. So, over to you. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Mohammed Idris. Quite a few of you probably know me. I came from Bangladesh in '76 as a student. I studied physics. I came to Birmingham, became a social worker. I ran an advice center called Asian Resource Center. I became notorious in early 1980s because Thatcher government wanted to get rid of me from this country. I challenged it because I said British immigration law is racist and I want to establish my right. I am not an academic. I never wrote a book. I'm not a writer. But I have written a book. It's called The Making of Bangladesh as I Saw It. It's literally as I saw it, because in 1971, when the West was preoccupied with the Vietnam War and soon expecting a defeat in the hands of Viet Cong, there was another war raging in East Pakistan. That was another guerrilla war. I was 21. I was a student of Dhaka University, which was the hotbed of daring political activities and new way of looking at politics. I saw things which led to the war in 1971. I lived through the war in '71. I saw things with my eyes, and I thought it is now being exploited. The glorious fight we fought is being exploited by our politicians for their political gain. So I thought I'll write it down what I saw. And that's exactly what it is. It's not a theoretical, I didn't want to give anybody any analysis of things, but I plainly put what I saw. The book is still not for sale in England. I got a flyer over here, you will be able to see it. It will soon be available. We're expecting it to be sold through eBay in next couple of weeks. It will cost you £8. I ask you to buy it and read it, not because I'm giving you any knowledge, but it's just a fact seen by an ordinary person. Why did I come here today to speak? It's a decolonizing of the mind. The way I see it, the colonialism, in my view, the way I saw it, is a political term. And British went and colonized our country. But if you look at the history of it, it began with a business concern. East India Company did not have any other intention except doing business in India and earning money, and that's what they did. And they ended up taking over the country. When we fought against this colonization, it was a political fight. And political fight needed a cultural dimension to change our mindset, because we were colony for 200 years. Our politicians, our intellectuals, our poets, our writers, their mindset was set by the British. And 86 years now, or 76 years now, from the day British left India, we are still talking about decolonizing our mind. Why? Because essentially our writers, our intellectuals did not support the anti-colonial movement. People like Bankim Chandra, he thought we should support the British rule because they had allowed us to practice our religion freely. Rabindranath Tagore, the famous writer, he wrote books to criticize the revolutionary movement of Bengal. Neeraj Chandra Chaudhary, you heard of him, very right-wing writer. He wrote an autobiography of an ordinary person, and he dedicated his book to the glorious British Empire, because everything good in us was created, cherished, and developed by the British Empire. And he disliked the independent India so much that at the age of 70, he migrated to England, and he lived his life in Oxford. And he continued to support, he lived for 98 years, and he continued to support to his last days that British the things which has gone wrong with the world is because the British no longer rules the world. Bangladesh movement essentially was not started with political movement. It started as a cultural movement. Bangladesh movement started in 1952, when the newly independent country of Pakistan and its founding father, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, who was a Gujarati speaker,